Now, more from you about the Arab American scene. Who does represent legitimate Arab American interests in this country? Who should the press be talking to?
Well, this is the dilemma of it. We have to be practical here. I'm not going to entertain any illusions about, even though my instincts would like to go in that direction, but the condition of Arab Americans in this country is like an orphan. Those who have the money claim to represent them, and that is not true. Those who don't have the money and would like to represent them don't, because they simply don't have the wherewithal to do that. So the condition of Arab Americans, the condition of Muslims in this country, is that of an orphan. There is no one that represents them.
What about ADC, which at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, which first of all isn't on K Street, and second of all, at least does have some grassroots? What's your view of it?
Well, let me put it this way. ADC had what may be called grassroots. And they had that grassroots simply because of the climaxing that took place in the late 70s and early 80s. It was off of that trend, off of that momentum.
People needed somewhere to go.
That's right. And
once a year.
Desperation,
right.
Someone came across with, broad statements, the Palestinian issue should be supported, something should be done, we should, open up our energies and begin contact.
There was no real substance to it, but at least the statements weren't so terrible.
That's right. They were, in a sense, they were attractive. And so that's why they had grassroots at that time. But let's not lose sight of the fact that it's been going downhill. And I think it would take...
Very far downhill.
Right now, it's almost bottoming off.
There's not much left.
That's right.
Right.
And if they... I've come in contact with some of them who represented ABC. Some of them are really nice people. But we're not looking for nice people as much as we are looking for the social contract that has been absent in Arab reality almost for uncountable generations.
Okay. But by social contract, do you mean, if I can sum it up, honest and capable people who represent legitimate concerns of their community?
The hopes and the frustrations of their community. That's
and you have not one organization to go to.
I say this regrettably, but it's the fact. There is no one organization or all of the multiple organizations put together who represent the plight of the Arab community, whether it's an extension of the original Arab community in the Middle East, or whether it's one that has been assimilated into the American life here.
But isn't that in fact the goal that the ambassadors and their regimes concocted in the late 70s and early 80s? They didn't want a mosque that had elected leaders. They didn't want organizations that could speak up. They wanted only mouthpieces and places to hold conferences and hand out awards and have banquets. And that's exactly what they got. Now, on the other hand, you have a number of Islamic organizations now. You have the American Muslim Council, and you have CARE, Council on
American Islamic Relations.
Okay, you have these two national groups. Tell me about these groups.
Well, these groups...
Don't hold your punches.
Yeah, I know. I speak the truth. I try to, publicly and privately. That's why many times I'm not around. But anyways, these are a little different from the ADC and the AAI, etc., because they come from that agitation of the Islamic background. This is undeniable. The problem, though, is when it comes to the finances, these organizations have, or the leaders of these organizations, the AMC or CARE or ISNA or ICNA or whatever.
Haven't you heard of these?
Yeah, these are Islamic Society of North America, Islamic Circle of North America, etc. There's a few others around. But the problem with these setups is that they've realized years and years ago that Muslims and Arabs and Middle Easterners in this country, they don't have a voice that echoes their sentiments, their worldview. So what they did was they said, we have to go for the money. And they looked around, where's the source of the money coming from? They found the source of the money that they could get is from Saudi Arabia.
At a time, Kuwait was throwing a lot in as well, and there were other places that you could get some.
Yeah, when I say Saudi Arabia, in addition to that, I mean also its transmutations, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, etc. These are all basically the same setup. So, Saudi
the Gulf
Arabia,
societies,
yeah.
And it was done through an interlocking group of business people. It wasn't direct, these grants weren't coming from governments, they were coming from business people and foundations that were set up.
At one time they were coming from everyone, from government and business people, etc., especially during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, etc. It was very convenient to say we're supporting Islamic groups, whether it was a government official or whether it was a successful entrepreneur.
But this is a conscious strategy that these regimes and money sources have used, knowing that these groups, if they're to be viable in terms of offices and staff, have to have a source of money. And since your community at the grassroots has never been able to supply or willing to supply a source of money. But it wasn't just for groups of your kind, it was for all kinds of groups, including the American Enterprise Trust, the group that publishes the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, purporting to be an independent journal. This is an interlocking group of secular foreign service officers in cahoots with Qataris and Saudis and Kuwaitis who over the years have propagandized America through their publication. You're shaking your head, yes.
Yes, because when you read these, and I read them, I subscribe, and I'm abreast with what they have to say about the Middle East. When it comes to the Islamic element of the Middle East, they have no favorable words to say about an Islamic change in Egypt or an Islamic change in the Arabian Peninsula or in Turkey.
And they have no negative words to say about the client regimes.
That's right.
They're real good on Israel, but in recent years they've even tempered that because of the peace process.
That's right.
The quote-unquote
That's right.
peace
They
process.
even run promotionals for the client regimes in Qatar. They had
the Washington Report.
Washington Report.
It looks like an advertising supplement.
Okay. See?
But that's because they have to send those issues primarily over to the Middle East to get next year's budget.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the peace process, Palestine. You're not Palestinian, even though the way you presented yourself at the beginning of this program, Lebanon, Syria, you called it the Holy Land.
I make no distinction between anyone who comes from the Fertile Crescent, even though we do have these European nation-state concept imposed on us. And I don't think any Palestinian is going to tell you, I'm really different from a Syrian or a Lebanese. Or
well, this generation, after a number of generations living this way and having no contact, the separation has taken its toll. But this is Mideast Realities. I'm your host. I'm Mark Bruzonsky. This is Mohamed Alassi, who has lived here in Washington for about the same period of time I've lived here. I haven't been in the American military like you. I have participated in Jewish political affairs when I was an establishment person. Sounds like you were a relatively establishment person. Let's talk about the peace process. What, in your view, is going on with the Palestinians today, or what is being imposed on the Palestinians today?
Well, the Palestinians, I think, are really the end victims of the decision makers who have realized that they are running out of time. The Arab governments, as they are today, as they have been, in addition to the Israeli government, have realized that there is a new power, there is a new force in the making in all of these areas. And that is the Islamic wave of the future.
In Palestine, that's Hamas.
In Palestine, it's Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hizb ut-Tahrir. There are many, it's not just Hamas. The media conveniently here concentrates on Hamas. Hamas may be...
well, the best known of them.
Yeah. Anyways, all of these have recognized Netanyahu and his predecessors, Mubarak and his predecessors, Fahd and his predecessors, King Hussein, who hasn't had a predecessor since probably one of the most ancient...
Since his grandfather was assassinated, right next to him.
Yeah. All of them have realized that there is an Islamic wave that is coming. There's flows and ebbs to this wave. They know that, we know that. But it is coming on strong. And so they find that there's something in common.
So they want to undermine it.
All of them together.
Right.
And
if that means getting to bed with the Israelis and the Americans, well, we've really been in bed with them anyway. We just haven't acknowledged it.
That's right. So right now, this peace process is a euphemism for a united front against this Islamic wave. This peace process...
But flesh that out. I think I understand you. I'm not so sure the viewers are if we don't flesh it out a little more. A peace process in order to defang or to slow down or to co-opt this wave that you speak about, to take the energy out of it, to make pretenses that things are getting better when in fact they're not. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, let me put a little more punch into this. The observable facts on the ground in the Middle East is that the Islamic Revolution in Iran is a fact of life now. They don't want to confess to this through their mouthpieces, the media extensions they have.
Much more than that, they want to undo it.
Exactly. And they have another word for it in Algeria. They want to eradicate it. They call the military junta there that is at war with its own people the eradicators. Those are the generals. They're called the eradicators there. They want to kill off anyone who has Islamic aspirations, anyone who has a sense of Islamic political expression, etc. And we have also a low simmering type of pre-Civil War status in Egypt that has been going on for years, but it also has been going through cycles. It becomes stronger year after year. And we also have the same type of thing in Lebanon, where right now the fear is Hezbollah is working on two fronts. It is a military force in the south of the country, but it also has its politicians lodged in the Lebanese parliament.
All right, but take us back to the fulcrum of this, the Israeli-Palestinian conundrum, predicament in Palestine. What is this peace process, and how do you view it?
Well, this peace process is the acknowledgement by the Israeli establishment that gave recognition to a Palestinian establishment that shares, that right now falls into line with Arab officialdom plus Israeli policy. Now you have the PNA, the Palestinian National Authority, that has lined itself up broke from its own people.
The PA for the Israelis and the Americans, the PNA for the PNA.
Yeah.
Right. There's no national to it.
Yeah.
It's an authority. But let's not fall into their traps. That's like calling the West Bank Judea and Samaria.
Or you could call it the Palestinian Local Authority.
Well, that'd be closer to reality.
Yeah. So, anyways, they've convinced this layer of Palestinian politicians, Yasser Arafat and his inner circle.
Pretty thin layer.
Yeah, pretty thin one. They've convinced them that they have to jump on that bandwagon, fighting this war of wars against this Islamic threat.
Well, actually, I think the PA, the Arafat people, used the Islamic threat to frighten the Americans and the Israelis and the Hashemites and the Saudis, saying, if you don't work... I've sat with Faisal Husseini, Arafat's top man in Jerusalem, in the days just before these agreements, and he would say, if something doesn't change here soon, when you come back, you'll have to go speak to the people with the beards, not to me. So
I'm sure different forces at different times have tried to use Islamic representatives or Islamic organizations for their own needs. Whether they are Israeli, whether they are Arab governments, the Saudi government is very adept at this.
Come on, we've talked about Saudis and Bandar and Zogby, and what's your view of Arafat?
Arafat is just another one of them. Exactly. He's the weakest in that chain, but he belongs to that same line.
Would you use the same term you used about Bandar?
Oh, yeah.
Traitor?
Yeah, but Arafat doesn't have the finances to throw around the types of crimes and the types of massacres that Bandar has his hands in. I think if Arafat was given the same finances, the same potential, the same resources as Bandar has, then he'd probably be playing.
Well, but the whole goal with Arafat, as I understand it, but here, the reason I have you on the program is, correct me if I'm wrong, or the whole idea is to keep Arafat on a short leash. The whole idea is to give him only so much money, only so many guns, and his job is to keep people on the reservation down. And if he doesn't do his job, they'll find someone else.
Yeah, that's right.
But meanwhile, he signs these documents that he admittedly doesn't even understand what they are and hasn't read, and then he is offered a certain amount of guns and a certain amount of money and a certain amount of false promises. And this too goes back to the 1918 period, because I have personally studied that period. The promises that were made at that conference to the Arab leaders, to Emir Faisal, they were all lies. None of the promises were ever fulfilled. And the promises that were made to the Palestinians are totally, would it be fair to say that the Palestinians are now in the process of being put onto reservations?
Oh, you'd be elevating their status. that they would be put on reservations.
Well, what would you call it?
Oh, it's a wicked, and it's a vile, and it's a malicious type of apartheid that the Palestinians right now, it's discrimination as never experienced by human beings that the Palestinians are enduring right now. Arafat, unfortunately, has taken the side. Now, what's the difference? Be a Palestinian for a moment, if you can. What's the difference between Arafat towards the Palestinians and, let's say, Atif Hussein towards Palestinians, or Hafez Assad towards Palestinians, or Mubarak towards Palestinians?
Well,
there is no difference.
It's another client regime.
That's right.
But the difference is that this client regime is not even given the trappings of sovereignty. This client regime, the Palestinians having been oppressed for so long, is thrown even smaller scraps. I at least use the phrase they're being put onto reservations. You thought that was being extremely generous to what the Israelis are doing to them.
Absolutely. The type of, especially in the past several months, the type of blockades and curfews and house arrests that have been going on in Gaza and the West Bank, something that the press doesn't want to speak about. The conditions there are terrible, horrendous.
Well, there's no question that the situation for Palestinians in every way, from economically to spiritually to psychologically, is far worse in the aftermath of the Oslo agreements than it was before them. No question about it.
And that is why it's difficult for Arafat to ride the Palestinian people. Because in the case of, let's say, Syrians, Jordanians, Egyptians, just to take the adjacent peoples, in their cases, the rulers have also always been a step ahead. So they know how to tame the following condition. If their people are going to express some type of outrage, they would have that leisure of the time space to prepare for it. Arafat doesn't have that, because the frustration and the anger and the type of pent-up feelings that have been working inside the Palestinian psychology has put Arafat at a disadvantage. He doesn't have that leisure of preparing to remold or mold his constituencies or his people the same way King Hussein can do, although King Hussein is running out of time very quickly, but the same way the other rulers in adjacent areas have been able to do. So Arafat is riding a lion, not like Fahd, who's riding a camel.
You're watching Mideast Realities. This is our weekly program showing on public access channels around the country. We're talking today, I'm your host, I'm Mark Bruzonsky, and we're talking today with Mohamed Alassi. Mohamed has lived in Washington for quite some time. He knows the ins and outs of the Arab American community and of the Islamic community and of the Arab world. He has served as the first and only elected imam of the Washington Mosque here in Washington. And we're now talking about, after having surveyed the Arab world and the Washington scene, we're talking about the so-called peace process in Palestine. You know, it really evolved out of the Gulf War and the Bush administration, don't you think? I mean, they were so worried that the American imposition of itself in the Middle East with military forces for the first we've always been there over the horizon and under the table. But now we were there as a colonizing military force. And they legitimately understood that with the Islamic Revolution and with the Gulf War, this tide you speak of was rising fast. And one of their ways of controlling it was to call the Madrid Conference and say, but we Americans are in the forefront of bringing peace and justice to the Middle East. So you're laughing, but that is the terminology that was used. And then the Palestinians were essentially made naked and penniless and destitute. So when a few bones were thrown in their way, they got Arafat to take on this role. But before they got Arafat to accept this role, they had to strip him down. And they destroyed the PLO. And they destroyed all of the relationships between the PLO and the Arab regimes. And finally, Arafat's choices were to resign and or retire and write a book about how bad things were, or to do what he's done all his career, which was accept the handouts, the money, and the guns from whoever would offer it to him at the time. This time the offer came from his former enemies, the Americans and the Israelis. And it also came at a time when all of the senior PLO personalities had either been assassinated or had been removed in one way or another. So it was just Arafat himself. There were no other major Palestinian personalities to prevent Arafat from doing what he has now done. Now, where do you think this is going? I'm not asking you to be a prophet for 50 years from now. The next 5 or 10 years, where do you think this is going?
I think the whole scenario is developing contrary to the calculations of Israeli, American, and Arab decision makers. They think that they have the whole Middle East turning into a peace process. I think what they are really doing is they are militarizing the Middle East. The grand mistake that Israeli, American, Arab decision and policy makers committed was to pick a fight with this Islamic politicization of the whole area. That's the only way to build it instead of destroy it.
Well, if so, coming out of the American Jewish community as I have, and knowing about the regimes and organizations, this fight was fueled tremendously by the Zionist lobby and by the Israelis. They want this fight. They want the West in this confrontation. Yes.
That's right.
It didn't just happen.
Yeah, you see, from an Israeli Zionist point of view, they needed protection. They see this as a threat concerning them more than it is a threat concerning someone who's living in California or someone who's living in Montana. Obviously, they are living in the Middle East, and they are living in what they themselves call a hostile neighborhood. And so when they see a spark of Islamic self-determination beginning in Iran, and then they see another spark of Islamic determination in North Africa, there's one to the east, one to the west, another one to the south, another one to the north. In these sparks, so they feel the most threatened. And what becomes the reaction of a person or people who are in immediate danger? They want to protect themselves by any means possible.
Not only that, but those who remember the history of the Middle East, what the Israelis have done, what they did in Lebanon not all that long ago, are aware that there are forces that will want revenge when and if they ever come to power.
And see, this is the mistake of destiny that the Israeli Zionists have committed. I'm not going to try to pretend that I can psychologically figure this thing out. They came from Europe, they've lived for thousands of years in a hostile diaspora, and they think that the people in the Middle East have to be treated the same way they were treated in Europe to repulse